Former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, the longest serving state legislative leader in U.S. history, has been found guilty on 10 felony corruption charges. Will that change anything in Springfield? From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, February 14th. I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. After a 4-month trial and just over 2 weeks of deliberations, a federal jury finally reached its verdict Wednesday. Michael J. Madigan, who served the better part of 40 years as Speaker of the Illinois House, was pronounced guilty on 10 felony counts of corruption. That same jury found Madigan not guilty on 7 other charges, and the jury deadlocked on 6 other charges against Madigan and his co-defendant, longtime lobbyist and close ally to the Speaker, Michael McLean. The verdict marked what might be described as the final page in a long chapter of Illinois history. The man who was not only Speaker of the House for all those years, starting in 1983, but also spent years as chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, is now looking at the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, not unlike some of the people who served in the governor's office during that same time. CNI reporter Hannah Meisel was in the courthouse throughout the 4-month trial. She was also a State House reporter who covered Madigan during his final 7 years as Speaker, and she's with us today to help us understand what happened. Hannah, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So it's been said that very few things ever got through the Illinois legislature while he was Speaker for all those years without his stamp of approval on it. How big of a presence was he in the State House and in Illinois politics generally?
Well, he was a huge presence. He really loomed large in people's minds. If ever you're asking about a bill as a reporter, or, if you're a lobbyist trying to get your bill shopped around to different legislators, the most common question is, where's the speaker on this? So he was huge. He was just kind of a contrast to his actual presence, both physical. As it was once noted to me, Madigan was one of many powerful men in Chicago and Illinois politics who have been kind of short in stature, but also his personality. Unlike a lot of politicians, he didn't have that big gregarious personality, but it's kind of his quiet and strategic mind that the quiet way he'd wield his power that he got this nickname, the Velvet Hammer, decades ago. He was a master of using the House rules to either push things through really quickly or to put a brick on something. And, he was also a master of strategy when it came to big picture politics, and one of his greatest strengths being legislative map making, which in part helped him grow his House Democratic majority decade by decade.
So after all of those years, he had a particular style of management, a particular style of politics, I guess, that many people have just thought of as synonymous with corruption. Other people might just say, he was very political in nature. Everything was sort of transactional with him. What was the basis behind the actual corruption charges brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office?
So this is a very complicated case. There were 23 charges. And, you could think of the case in kind of 3 separate silos. One was alleged bribery scheme over 8 years having to do with electric utility Commonwealth Edison. Another was a similar but much smaller alleged scheme having to do with AT&T Illinois. And then there was Madigan's dealings with Chicago alderman turned FBI mole Danny Solis. And in that, the feds had charged 3 separate things having to do with Solis introducing Madigan to a certain developer. That's, the developer that got the feds interested in Madigan in the first place back in 2017. And then a land transfer deal in Chicago's Chinatown neighborhood that never actually ultimately came to fruition. And then there was an effort to get Solis appointed to a lucrative state board seat, which also never came to fruition. Very complicated case. And then on top of all of that, there was this one big overarching racketeering charge. And as we'll talk about, a lot of them did not end up bearing out with this particular jury.
So explain to us, what was he convicted of? What were the guilty verdicts based on?
Sure. So in the end, he was convicted of 10 of the 23 charges, including three bribery conspiracy charges having to do with his allies getting no work jobs and contracts at ComEd, and then plus three associated wire fraud charges. Um, you know, this is probably the part of the case that, was the simplest to understand.
There were major pieces of legislation having to do with electric utilities. One of them had enabled utilities like Commonwealth Edison to have automatic rate increases in order to generate funds for building out infrastructure or modernizing infrastructure. There were other, like a bailout of the nuclear power plants. And the allegation was, are you saying that the allegation was that those got through in exchange for Commonwealth Edison giving these no-work jobs to his friends and allies?
Yes, although I would put it a little bit more technically. It doesn't matter if, in the eyes of the law, whether these laws got through because of these alleged contracts and jobs for Madigan allies. In fact, I think anyone who had been around the State House and who've also sat through these trials could see that ComEd worked very hard on its legislative strategy. But what matters in the eyes of the law is that the intent was there, and that this jury found that the intent was there. And, I think it's interesting that not all of these ComEd-related charges stuck. But the part that was easiest to understand, I think, upset the, people, anyone that you would tell this, try to summarize the case in 3 minutes, the fact that these 5 Madigan allies got paid sometimes, in some cases over many years, $4,000 a month, $4,500 a month, $5,000 a month for doing no work, adding up to $1.3 million over 8 years for these 5 men. That is upsetting. And, the foreman told me that, it was very obvious that Madigan knew about these jobs, these, no work contracts, despite, his attorney's attempts to distance himself from it.
Okay. And then, was there any particular evidence that was really damaging that convinced the jury that he was guilty?
Yeah, I would point to this one call in the spring of 2018, which was very soon after the feds started wiretapping longtime State House lobbyist Mike McLean, who was a co-defendant in this case, we'll talk about later, wiretapping his cell phone. And McLean is talking to his old colleague, John Hooker, who was a longtime in-house ComEd lobbyist, whereas McLean was ComEd's longtime contract lobbyist. And the two of them are talking about how Madigan wants to get soon-to-be retired Chicago alderman Mike Zaleski one of these contracts. And we can play the clip.
Okay, let's listen to that now.
So if you remember, we have some people that are recommendations from our friend that are paid by us, but they work under Jay Doherty.
Yes.
Remember that?
I remember.
Yeah. And so he's asked to add an additional person. Alderman Mike Szalinski.
Oh, okay.
And they refer to our friend. Who is our friend? Remind us again.
So our friend is a euphemism that McLean used all the time on these wiretap calls and in the secretly recorded videos. It's a euphemism for Madigan. He actually explained once in a call, one of these wiretap calls, that he says our friend because you never know who might be listening, and so it's better than actually using Madigan's name. So, the feds really leaned into this kind of mystique of our friend, of, the fact that Madigan famously never used a cell phone, never had a cell phone, never used email. That was very interesting there. But, this call.
And that's one of the first things I noticed when I came to Illinois in 2019, which was the very end of the Madigan era. And I learned that the Speaker of the House doesn't carry a cell phone, doesn't have an email address, doesn't text, doesn't email, doesn't use any high-tech forms of communication. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Wonder why.
Yeah.
Was he just kind of an old-fashioned, low-technology kind of guy, or was he just very deliberately avoiding being tapped or surveilled?
Well, the feds have the power to wiretap landlines, and certainly Madigan was talking on landlines all the time. A lot of his job was on the phone, and he's on a lot of these McLean tapes because he's calling from one of his various offices. But, on the witness stand, he explained that he didn't have a cell phone because he didn't want one. He wanted his day to be over at 6 o'clock or whatever, because he had been working since 8 a.m. And he's a person of a different generation. He's 82 going on 83. And I don't know, but it's certainly something that's the feds leaned into, and it's certainly something that certainly his, critics over the years have pointed to as something that's nefarious. And you know what? In the trial of Madigan's former chief of staff, Tim Mapes, in the summer of 2023, an FBI agent got on the stand, and he noted that Madigan, his lack of use of emails and cell phones, made him look a lot like the leader of a mafia family.
Okay. And so talk to us a little bit about the charges on which he was acquitted, or that they couldn't reach a verdict on.
Sure thing. So one of the things that he was acquitted of on ComEd was this idea that this Latino businessman, Juan Ochoa, who had been around Illinois politics for a long time, an ally of a former Congressman Luis Gutierrez and current Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia, they came to him in 2017. They came to Madigan, rather, in 2017, asked him to support Juan Ochoa's appointment to the ComEd board. He said yes. And, the feds said that this was part of the larger alleged ComEd bribery scheme, but in the end, the jury did not find that. He was also acquitted of trying to get the bribery charge when it came to getting Danny Solis that lucrative state board seat, but he was convicted on the related Travel Act charges, which I thought was really interesting. And then you have these 6 charges that the jury could not come to a consensus on. They were deadlocked, in some 11-1 and some 11-2, but actually in favor of acquitting the speaker. And it was just 1 or 2 holdouts on these charges, people who wanted to actually vote guilty. And so you have everything having to do. I should say he was also acquitted of this extortion charge. The feds had alleged that the first real estate developer that Madigan had reached out to Danny Solis on in 2017, which, at the time, Solis had already been cooperating with the FBI for a year, and it changed the direction of the FBI's investigation at that point when Madigan reached out and started directing Solis to kind of draw him in. And the feds alleged that this one developer who was building this giant apartment complex in Chicago's booming West Loop neighborhood, that Madigan had extorted him because Danny Solis had, put this idea out there that there was a quid pro quo, that he, as the head of Chicago City Council's zoning board, wouldn't give the necessary zoning changes to this developer unless they hired Madigan's law firm. Madigan ended up, confronting Solis about that in a meeting. Let's roll that tape.
Okay.
Over the phone, you made a comment that there was a quid pro quo.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
You shouldn't be talking like that.
All right.
You're just recommending.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because if they don't get a good result on the real estate taxes, the whole project will be in trouble.
Yeah.
Which is not good for your ward.
Good. Good.
So you want high quality representation.
Right.
And there, Madigan is a little bit off mic. It's clear that one person is wearing the wire and Madigan is a number of feet away. But he's saying, you used the words quid pro quo. You shouldn't be talking like that. Let's not use those words.
That's right. And, he goes on to explain, you're just recommending our law firm because, they want good representation or else their project's in trouble. The feds tried to say that Madigan was providing him some sort of alternate cover story. But Madigan, he got on the witness stand in early January, which was, big surprise to everyone in the courtroom. And he explained, that he wanted to confront Solis, but he just didn't want to do it, in the moment over the phone because he needed to think about it because, he was kind of shocked that Solis would say the words quid pro quo. And in fact, when Solis was on the witness stand in November, he described that as dumb. And so, Madigan was acquitted of all of the counts, the attempted extortion, the related travel act counts having to do with that developer. But he was, the jury deadlocked on these charges that had to do with this project in Chinatown that Solis really wanted to get done. It was, a portion of Chinatown was in Solis's 25th ward. And there is a parking lot that still remains to this day, and it's owned, the land is owned by the Illinois Department of Transportation. It's leased out, as it has been for years, to this nonprofit organization who runs it as a low-cost parking lot, because if you've ever been to Chinatown, it's really, really hard to park there.
It's impossible.
With validation, you can get a parking spot for only $2 at this parking lot. But what Solis had wanted, and what some other real estate developers had wanted over years, was to take some of that land and build a mixed-use apartment complex on that. And Solis asked for Madigan's help. Several months after they started, calling back and forth after that first reach out in June of 2017. Solis asked for Madigan's help on the state side, and Madigan agreed to help. He got Mike McLean involved, who then got another lobbyist involved. And, ultimately, this never happened. The land transfer never happened because it was never put into the annual land transfer bill. This is, all kind of esoteric, but this was a bribery charge. Another two wire fraud, a travel act, and this is some of the ones that the jury deadlocked on and said we don't believe this. And then finally, like I said earlier, the jury did acquit Madigan on the bribery charge having to do with promising to get Solis appointed to a state board, but did convict him on the related travel act counts. And what the jury foreman had told me just about Solis in general was this is obviously not a good guy. This is a person who cooperated with the FBI undercover for 2.5 years. The FBI, they had enough on him. He was, doing his own bribery acceptance. He was misusing his own campaign funds. But instead of charging him in 2016, they gave him the opportunity to cooperate, which he took. And, Madigan's attorneys did their best to prove, during their, cross-examination in their own defense case, that Solis kept breaking the law thereafter, and he, lied on his taxes even for years after he got this kind of sweetheart deal. And so for the jury, they kind of felt like this guy, Danny Solis, he gets on the stand and he's, lying to save his own skin, and,
detracted from his credibility, obviously.
Right, exactly. But they did say, though, that, Madigan, after that first, it was maybe a couple phone calls in after Madigan had initially reached out about this real estate developer in 2017, that after Solis mentioned quid pro quo, even though, yes, they found his explanation believable, that, he had confronted Solis about it and thought the matter was taken care of, they thought, like, Madigan should not have continued to associate himself with Solis, and yet he did.
Yeah. Okay. So talk to us a little bit about the co-defendant, Mike McLean. He was a longtime close associate, close friend of Madigan. Where did he come from? What was his role in all of this?
Right. So Mike McLean had been around the State House almost as long as Madigan. Madigan was elected to the Illinois House in 1970. And was colleagues with McLean's father, Elmo Mac McLean, for a couple of years until in 1972, Elmo McLean actually, he was having heart problems, and he was having angina pains, according to, several accounts I've found. But he really wanted to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. That was one of the biggest things happening in the early 1970s. He was in the nurses' station in the Capitol. He got on the floor. He voted. Of course, it ultimately went down. But after that, he had a massive heart attack on the floor, was transported to a local hospital in Springfield, and ultimately died. So Mike McLean took his place, and, soon thereafter, as young legislators in the House, Mike and Mike, they got to know each other and they became good friends. And then in 1982, which was the first amendment after the first election cycle after voters had approved this so-called cutback amendment, which dramatically decreased the size of the Illinois House, McLean was actually voted out, and but then he became a lobbyist, and he continued to be very good friends with Madigan. And, on a lot of these wiretap calls, you can hear McLean describe himself as an agent of Madigan. He was often sent to do things that Madigan would rather not do, especially when it came to delivering bad news to people. So they were very close, and they talked all of the time. We heard so many calls between the two of them. But when Madigan got on the witness stand, he tried to distance himself from McLean, which I will also say that the foreman said, seemed a little bit unbelievable.
The word lobbyist comes from the activity of hanging out in the lobby of a legislator's office, in the lobby of the governor's office, a lobby of state agencies, waiting for officials to come out so you can grab them and talk to them. And I've read accounts of Michael McLean. He didn't wait in the lobby. He walked up and down. He was in and out of the speaker's office. There's this whole suite of offices on the third floor of the Capitol in between the House and Senate chambers that belong to the speaker. And he was just walking in and out of there like, it was his office.
Yeah, I mean, all of the staff knew him when he would call, the wiretaps. We've heard a lot of those where the secretaries know who he is, obviously, and they'll say, yeah, of course, I'll do this for you. I'll send this note. But he was not only just walking in and out, he would work out of one of the conference rooms in that office suite of offices on the third floor. McLean was a very sought after lobbyist and a very sought after strategist, a political strategist. And, Madigan used him in that way too. He was intimately involved in a lot of, campaign strategy over the years. McLean, like I mentioned earlier, also, he was, ComEd's top contract lobbyist for years and years. And, he was convicted, as were three other former ComEd lobbyists and executives in the ComEd 4 trial in 2023, which is kind of like the other side of those ComEd related charges in this trial, where the four of them were found guilty for trying to influence Madigan's, trying to bribe him basically through these jobs and contracts for his allies. And I also thought it was interesting that the foreman told me that, when they got into the deliberation room, they wondered why McLean wasn't charged, in the ComEd related charges. But they figured, especially because some of them had heard, and it was asked of them during jury selection all the way back in October, had you heard of this ComEd 4 case? You know anything about it? And so they kind of inferred from that McLean must have been convicted in that.
Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit to 2020. The investigation from the U.S. Attorney's Office is starting to deepen. There are leaks coming out. The noose is kind of tightening around Mike Madigan's neck. Commonwealth Edison enters into a deferred prosecution agreement in which they admit that they've been involved in a years-long bribery scheme, doing favors for Madigan in exchange for legislation. Madigan lost his bid for another term. He lost support from within the Democratic caucus in the House. He was not reelected as Speaker. And it was Emanuel Chris Welch was elected in his place, and we can maybe get to that later. He leaves the Speaker's office, then he resigns his House seat and eventually steps down as the Democratic Party chair. And I'm sort of wondering, to what extent do you think that his shadow still kind of hangs over the State House? Does his presence still kind of influence the culture of the State House, or have people kind of moved on and is he kind of now forgotten?
I think the answer is both. Madigan, of course, spent 50 years as a legislator and 36 of them as House Speaker. He influenced a lot of the things that we consider normal for having covered the State House. This has really been my only beat as a professional journalist for 11 years. So I don't know any different. Of course, you've covered Kansas legislature, and so a whole different environment. But for me, as they say, like, this is water, and I don't know any different. But at the same time, I think that we have moved on in certain ways. My gosh, like, there's been so much turnover in the legislature. Not just in the 4 years since he's been gone, but, in the time that I've been covering it, there are very few, lifetime or close to legislators left. And, I think, you mentioned Speaker Welch. He is completely different than Madigan in a lot of ways. Some ways that are, like I talked about earlier, Madigan is not gregarious. He was very quiet. He wielded power in that way. And Welch is very different. He really wants to be liked. And I think Madigan kind of drew his strength from not caring whether he's liked. I think that things are different, but I think that also, critics of Madigan, and especially Republicans, they have a lot to gain, because it's not like Republicans in Illinois government have a lot of power, thanks in part to Madigan, but one of their only kind of moves is to keep blaming Madigan. And that's been, a move for 15, 20 plus years. And it's worked to various extents. Governor Bruce Rauner, who was elected in 2014, he staked a lot of his campaign and a lot of his governorship on blaming Madigan for, everything in state government. And, he spent millions of dollars to kind of make Madigan infamous and a household name in Illinois. And, that definitely worked. I think a lot more people are aware of who Mike Madigan is. But, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that it's going to take a while to move on just because he was in power for so long and because of, the way in which his influence made its mark on the state.
Okay. I want to turn now to Capital News Illinois reporter Ben Szalinski. When the news came down Wednesday, of course, the news was not unexpected, but there was a lot of reaction from current lawmakers in the House. You and I both spent the better part of that day chasing down and gathering up reactions as they came in. What struck you the most about the reactions, both from Democrats and from Republicans?
Well, I think what Hannah just mentioned, that the ghost of Mike Madigan, his legacy, is going to hang around the State House for a long time. And we really got two different reactions on Wednesday from lawmakers. On one hand, it seemed like Democrats would rather us not have asked about it. They want to move on. They pretty much uniformly said, this is in the past. We're focused on the future. We're focused on a more ethical legislature where we're focused on the people of Illinois and rather not so much ourselves, which is what a lot of the talk in the trial about Mike Madigan was. But then on the Republican side, it was a lot of kind of I told you so, as in what Republicans have said for so many years about Mike Madigan being this corrupt official was ultimately proven true by this jury's verdict on Wednesday.
Okay. I was thinking back to just before he was indicted by federal prosecutors. The scandal was becoming known. ComEd entered that now famous deferred prosecution agreement. And there were Republicans initiated moves to have Madigan removed from office, the internal disciplinary procedures. And there was, in fact, a House investigating committee. Two key figures in that. The person who chaired it was Emanuel Chris Welch, who is now the Speaker of the House. And the lead Republican was a Representative Ryan Spain from Peoria. He's now a deputy minority leader on the Republican side. Talk about the reactions that they put out, because they were, of course, very different.
Yeah, starting with Ryan Spain, his was probably a reaction of frustration, I think, especially towards Speaker Welch, because Welch was the leader of that special investigative committee. And when they looked into these allegations about ComEd and Mike Madigan, at that time, Madigan was simply known as Public Official A. He hadn't been charged with any wrongdoing. And ultimately, Speaker Welch and Democrats, they shut this investigation down pretty quickly, and Welch called it a sham that this investigation was undertaken. Fast forward, of course, to March 2022, we know Mike Madigan gets charged with 22 crimes related to ComEd. But Welch's reaction this week was one of more, well, it's a new day here in Illinois, essentially what he's been saying since he was elected Speaker after Madigan in 2021. And he said nowadays, essentially, Democrats are just focused on the working people. They're looking to move forward from the Madigan era. And, his way of business is an old way of doing business, and it's time to move on. The House has moved on. Ryan Spain says that's not the case, and that Welch himself, he should have shut down all these criminal charges against Madigan from the beginning back in 2020. This committee had an opportunity to get rid of Madigan out of the House, out of the speakership at that time, and they failed to do their duty. And ultimately, it turned out those allegations were correct and they were true. So I think those two kind of played off each other, where Spain was just extremely frustrated that ultimately the House did have an opportunity to do something about this, and they failed to do that back in 2020.
One of the ways that Michael Madigan was able to keep people loyal to him was that he was a prolific fundraiser. He had political action committees. He was in charge of the Democratic Party, the state Democratic Party. He was able to raise money and help people get elected. One of the people who did not depend on Mike Madigan to get elected was Governor J.B. Pritzker, who clearly has wealth of his own. He doesn't rely on anybody to raise money for him. What kind of reaction did we hear from Pritzker, who was not necessarily, didn't have a history of having to be loyal to Madigan?
Yeah, they certainly shared some of those bonds, as fellow Democrats. But unlike a lot of other governors, Pritzker didn't have to deal with Madigan for that long. Madigan was gone 2 years into Pritzker's tenure, whereas Madigan could really throw a wrench at other governors in his own party as well. So Pritzker's reaction on Wednesday, it was also kind of a look towards the future as well. But he said that the verdict sends, quote, an important message to anyone in government that if you choose corruption, you will be found out and you will be punished. So, some of this, I think, in Pritzker's mind is kind of also laying at, Donald Trump is also out there, somebody who has been charged with crimes of public corruption as well. And I think he's trying to kind of take a more even approach to this is not just a Madigan situation, but he wants to send a message that, government needs to be ethical and, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, that you should be punished and you will be found out if you commit any of these crimes. So the governor didn't focus too much on the Madigan verdict itself. I think he was really more just looking at this broad statement about public corruption. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, Pritzker and every Democrat in Illinois just really wishes this issue would go away because it is a bit of a thorn for them.
And then finally, the House Republican leader today, Tony McCombie from Savannah. What was she saying?
So Tony McCombie, she really had that "I told you so" attitude. She opened up the press conference right away saying, quote, "We all knew this day was coming." And as Hannah was talking about, this is what Republicans have been saying for so many years, that Mike Madigan was guilty of whatever type of public corruption the FBI was ultimately going to get him on. And Republicans, they're really changing their focus towards ethics reform. This is something they've been hammering nonstop for quite a few years, but especially since ComEd and especially since Madigan was charged with these crimes. And they say the legislature has simply not done enough. Lawmakers did pass some ethics reform in 2021. Ultimately, the legislative inspector general resigned her job because she thought that these ethics reforms were not good enough and they were actually going to make her job harder. So Republicans are really saying that this really needs to be a sign to Democrats that they need to take ethics reform seriously. There is a problem in their own house and they need to clean it up and pass some reforms that are going to make it harder for people to, have these kind of shady relationships across the legislative aisle with lobbyists. And then lastly, they focus on the House rules as well, where they say there needs to be more changes to kind of limit the power of the speaker. We know that Madigan had a ton of influence over those rules. We know that, bills ultimately were largely up to Mike Madigan if they were going to be called to the floor, and they needed support from the speaker most of the time to get called. And they say that still kind of remains true to this day, where it's a bit of an arbitrary selection that Democrats and the speaker make to decide what bills are going to be called for vote. And they want more member-driven initiatives to actually discharge bills, especially bipartisan bills, out of committees or into committees, and get those moving forward rather than just leaving it up to House Democratic leadership.
Okay, Hannah, we're going to give you the last word here. What's next? Is Michael Madigan going to appeal his convictions? Will there be a sentencing? Will there be a retrial on the charges where they deadlocked? What's next, if anything, in this case?
Well, the only thing that's scheduled for now is in early May, there will be a forfeiture trial, which will, determine how much Madigan will have to kind of pay. It's not like classic bribery, as the acting U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Illinois said the other day. It's not like the cash stuff in an envelope. It was more sophisticated bribery, of these jobs and contracts for Madigan's allies. But, still, we're going to have a little bit of a trial on forfeiture. But beyond that, we have not had a scheduling sentenced. We don't know whether the feds are going to go for a retrial on those 6 counts, including the racketeering, which to have lost a racketeering kind of case is very interesting that the feds were not able to make that case. But, it might have been just too many things spread out over too long a time for the jury to, put the pieces together in the way that the feds wanted to. And then also, we didn't even get to talk about it, but the related AT&T charge, which I described earlier as a much smaller, kind of scheme to the ComEd one, but similar. The jury deadlocked on that. And, in September, right before Madigan's trial started, a separate jury deadlocked on, a trial that was accusing ex-AT&T CEO President Paul Ascatza of having bribed Madigan in the same way. And so it's interesting that 2 separate juries now have deadlocked on that, element of the case. Paul Ascatza is scheduled to be retried in June. And then, ComEd 4 sentencings, those have been on hold for, more than a year now. And so we'll learn whether a sentencing might be scheduled or if there might be a retrial in the ComEd 4 case.
Okay, well, we will anxiously await your reporting on those developments. In the meantime, that'll do it for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. I want to thank my colleagues Hannah Meisel and Ben Szalinski. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.